Snow had a way of making the world speak in hushed tones, as if even the wind respected the small things. On the narrow stoop of a weathered row house, a child stood with his back to the street, breath fogging in a white ribbon that vanished fast. He wore his father's too big coat, the collar pulled up against a December bite, and his hands were tucked into pockets that weren't warm enough. His lips did not move. Inside, the little living room smelled faintly of cinnamon and damp wool. A single string of colored lights wrapped the sagging branches of a modest tree. A photograph in a thin frame leaned against the mantel, a stiffer-cut man in a suit, a woman smiling with hair like a cup of dark tea. Daniel Ward kept that photograph on the mantel because some pieces of a life didn't need explanation. They needed to be honored the way one tends a quiet fire. Daniel had been an engineer once, good with plans, capable of seeing how separate parts fit into a whole. A framed blueprint in the hallway, yellowing at the edges, suggested a different kind of steadiness, hands that had drawn out futures. Things had unfolded, however, in a way that blueprints rarely prepared a man for. Illness and hospital rooms took his wife first. Then, with the sting of medical bills and a slow tumble in work, the comfortable certainties eroded. He learned how to carry weight not on paper, but in clenched shoulders and midnight bank statements. The title he kept now, single father, carried with it a kind of precise love that made the smallest tasks sacramental. He was at once cook, laundromat runner, homework coach, and the one who remembers birthdays. His son, Ethan, had been a chatterbox in another season. He had arguments with the cat and trivia about dinosaurs. He made a mess of colored pencils and explained in emphatic detail imaginary kingdoms that kept him awake at night. The silence that had settled over him in the months since a frightening illness and a hospital stay felt like a separate, dense presence in the house. Doctors had used careful words, post-traumatic mutism, a reaction to shock. But the label never quite captured what Daniel felt when he came home to a house where nobody called his son's name aloud anymore. On the stoop, Ethan stood like an unread page. He had stepped out after a brief wander down the block, following a curiosity about a neighbor's bright wreath or a child's fleeting invitation to look at the holiday window. He had always been quick to answer when called. Not this time. The walk back to the house was another small journey for both of them, a test of courage and tenderness that no blueprint had covered. Daniel opened the door before Ethan reached the top step because he always did. Every return was worth meeting halfway. The house swallowed them both with warmth that wasn't loud but thorough. Heat pressed against their cheeks like a thoughtful hand.
Daniel's voice, low and steady, hummed an old tune without words as he reached for the kettle. Little rituals held the world together. How the kettle clicked, how the handkerchief with the embroidered initials was folded and set near the teacups. The handkerchief had been his wife's. The thread had thinned in places where the letters rubbed into softness. He kept it not as a relic, but as a bridge. Outside, some neighbors watched with the careful distance of people who had adopted pity as a polite shield. The street carried a mixture of compassion and impatience, the subtle declarations of those who think pity and distance are interchangeable. There were whispers, soft enough that only the winter could catch them. At the corner, a woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a heavy coat passed with a look that was more a question than an accusation. Why would someone make do with so little? She lived in the taller house with the polished porch and the gas lamps. She had a way of framing kindness like an article of fashion, easy to admire from a distance. Her name was Victoria Lane, though Daniel did not know it then. Her mailbox bore a monogram that seemed to say money could be mapped like streets. Her eyes, though, gave nothing away. Inside, the routines were a measured choreography. Daniel stirred stew with a wooden spoon until the surface broke into slow ripples. He hummed again the same tune, his wife's tune, because sound had a claim over the spaces grief tried to steal. Ethan sat near the small tree, hands busy with an ornament that had lost one of its beads, and he watched without comment. The lights made small islands on his cheeks. When Daniel glanced at him, there was patient love in the motion, not a demand. The house contained so many careful silences and one loud hope. Winter bills lay in a neat stack by the door. Utilities, a past due notice, an envelope that had come from the clinic, its typeface neutral and unforgiving. Daniel looked at them the way a man assesses weather forecasts, gracefully resigned but not defeated. He folded the handkerchief once, twice, and placed it in his pocket with the same rhythm he used to tuck a child's scarf. He did not let the bills become the language of the home. Instead, he turned on a tiny string of lights on the windowsill and sat with Ethan to build a paper snowflake, because there was always work, but also a duty to make ordinary magic where possible. The neighborhood's story was a collage of small judgments and small mercies. Some afternoons, the corner cafe would quietly exclude them, or the PTA's flyer would list a holiday program in a hall where an unspoken standard kept doors a little narrower for certain people. At the community center, though, there were pockets of warmth. Miss Alvarez, Ethan's teacher, who brought extra crayons and sat on the floor with a gaze that made children feel seen. Mr. Collins from the bodega down the street always made change with an extra smile for Ethan.
It mattered that little kindnesses threaded through the day. They did not cancel the cruelty, but they made the cruelty less defining. The harshness came in whispers and a single occasion that Daniel couldn't shake. The invitation, that was not an invitation. Each year, the neighborhood hosted a small winter showcase in the hall of the next block. Lights, hot cocoa, a list of the community's kids who would sing carols. The organizers' list had been posted on the window at the library. Daniel stopped by once on a morning with Ethan in tow, thinking perhaps he could muster the bravery to let his son stand among the others and be counted. The list had names arranged in neat columns. There was a properness to it that felt like a barrier rather than welcome. A few neighbors chatted under their breath. When Daniel asked the librarian whether anyone could join if they wished, the librarian's smile had an automatic limit that never fully stretched. "Usually it's by sign-up," she said, eyes flitting. "We have to plan." Not rejection so much as the sort that practices itself every year until it becomes a habit. Daniel had learned to carry such small ruptures with an even throat. He did not argue, not because he agreed, but because the argument would cost them in time and energy they couldn't spend. There was dignity and endurance, a quiet refusal to let the world define what mattered in the house. Instead, he made the Christmas they could afford and the traditions they could hold on to. He wrapped paper with the care of someone who understood the potency of small gestures. He left the tree as if the crown of their home, no matter how modest the branches. One afternoon, when Daniel came in from his night shift at the maintenance job, he found Ethan sitting at the table with a small, folded piece of paper in his hand. The boy's face, pale in the lamplight, showed concentration like someone deciphering a secret code. Daniel sat across the table, the kettle released into steam, and watched the careful motion of a child who had been practicing the shape of letters in silence. Without prompting, Ethan placed the paper in front of him, a scribbled drawing of two stick figures, one larger, one smaller, and a small house with a crooked roof. Underneath, in a child's hand, a single word had been attempted and crossed out. Daniel's throat made a small sound he would later confuse for a half-breath, half-laughter. He could not read what Ethan had intended, only that the attempt to reach him in written language was a bridge he could meet. Those bridges mattered. At times, the house felt like a fragile ledger of small wins and quiet losses, but the ledger also contained moments of grace. One morning, on his way home with extra groceries, Daniel noticed their neighbor Mrs. Park shoveling her walkway. She was elderly and moved with the deliberate caution of someone who had learned to use her body without rushing. Without thinking twice, Daniel crossed the property line and joined her for a few minutes, the sound of shovels turning snow into the rhythm of ordinary kindness. "Thank you," she said, not as much for the help as for the company. The gesture was small, but it folded the community in a way the larger events could not. People saw that. Some people chose to notice, others to ignore. And then there were the moments that rewired expectation. One chilly afternoon, a woman in an expensive coat watched Daniel from the high porch of her house as he carried a wobbling crate of canned goods down the street to the community food bank. He moved with care and quiet muscle, the crate balanced on his hip like an extension of his will. A group of schoolchildren shrank back as a gust swept a flyer down the sidewalk. Daniel stooped to pick it up and without fuss helped them chase it. Those small acts, helping a child with a stuck sled, returning a lost beanie, weren't grand gestures. They were the everyday kind of nobility that makes a neighborhood better, year after year. The woman on the porch, Victoria Lane, saw it. She was not the first to notice, but her notice landed in a different place because she had the means to fold a quiet gratitude into a tangible action. The season progressed with a series of minor tensions, overspent budgets, a missed call from a doctor that Daniel returned and found the waiting line full, a PTA email that spoke in procedural tones while Ethan sat with a paper crown slowly unraveling. There was, too, a small ache when Daniel caught his reflection in the window, a man carrying a child's future on shoulders that could, some nights, no longer be so steady. He had given up other dreams, not because life demanded it in epic gestures, but because love demanded the ordinary sacrifices: a second job, a missed night out, a refusal to let the child see fear more than hope. As Christmas approached, Daniel decided to make a ritual of the old things. He dug the handkerchief out of his pocket and ironed it like a prayer. He baked until the kitchen smelled like a memory, using a recipe his wife had scribbled onto the back of a grocery list. The small tree went up, its lights not extravagant, but chosen with the care of someone who understood how light can become testimony. He strung popcorn with Ethan, who sat still for the task, and let the tiny white circles collect on thin thread like small moons. Each night, Daniel hummed the same tune. The tune was a map back to a time when voices in the house were plentiful. It was also, subtly, a thread that might pull something loose. On Christmas Eve, the neighborhood had its annual caroling by the fountain: volunteers, cookies, and hot chocolate. Daniel had not planned to go. The idea of bringing Ethan into a chorus of voices made him cautious. Crowds could be kindly, but they could also expose. Still, a card slipped under their door arrived with a simple note: "Come for a walk."
"There's cocoa by the fountain, Miss Alvarez." It was an invitation without pressure. Daniel folded it into his pocket and debated. He wanted Ethan to taste the world beyond the front steps again, on his own terms. The evening unfurled with predictable tenderness. Some families strolled together with dog leashes and mittens. Children pressed their faces to window displays. A thin, hand-painted sign read, "Welcome," in a paint-heavy script. Ethan wandered a few steps from the railings at first, drawn by a child's lit lantern. He let go of his father's hand, just a little, because his feet needed the map of the pavement and the unfamiliar sounds of laughter. Daniel watched and did not call out. He had learned to trust the small explorations. He wanted his son's return to be a walk of his choosing. A moment later, a gust of wind picked up and flung a paper cup into Ethan's path. He bent to catch it, and the cup skittered across the ground toward a neighbor's porch. Without thinking, he followed. The porch light cast a rectangle on the snow. He stood a space from the polished steps and hesitated. In the doorway stood Victoria Lane, wrapped in the kind of coat that had a story of its own. She had been watching the festivities with an insulated cup in her hands. Until then, she had seemed like a fixture in the background, a polished presence that admired from afar. Now she leaned on the rail and regarded the small boy with a look less of judgment than mild curiosity. "Is he yours?" she asked, a question that held no malice. Daniel, who had caught up in a step, nodded. The exchange was ordinary and loaded all at once. Victoria smiled in a way that softened what might otherwise have been a polite dismissal. "He's very brave," she said. Daniel's chest warmed at the thing, because people rarely used words that had thought behind them. He thanked her. She nodded again and offered a small, practiced kindness. "If you ever need a lantern light, there's always one on my porch." It was a metaphor more than a physical offer, but the sentiment carried. Ethan walked away from the porch, and then, on his own, a little farther than Daniel expected. He reached the corner stoop of their house and stopped. The door was shut. Daniel's hand was already out to him, a reflex older than fear, older than any worry. Ethan stood for a moment in the snow, looking at the threshold as if it were a cliff that needed assessment. The world hummed with carols and the distant laughter of neighbors. Close up, the neighborhood sound folded into small domestic noises: a kettle's hiss, the rustle of a curtain. For a second, the street's laughter of distance felt like geography. Then Ethan stepped toward the door and put his small hand on the knob. He tried it once and failed. The knob was stiff from cold and old workings. He stepped back, rocked on his heels, and for a heartbeat the past months sat on his shoulders like a robe. He did not speak. He had not spoken when his mother died. The hospital's antiseptic air and the sudden, sharp rearrangement of his life had seen to that. People had suggested therapy, patience, songs. Daniel had given all of it and more. Loving a silent child asks a parent to become an interpreter and a container at once. Daniel stopped him, not with force, but with the gentleness of a man who had learned to hold life in careful hands. He bent down, as if to be nearer to the leaf-scratched doorknob, and met Ethan at eye level. The house smelled of warm bread, and a faint hint of his wife's perfume in the corner where the coat had hung. The handkerchief was in Daniel's pocket, its corners rubbed like thinking. He had tucked it there like a talisman, but he never made it more than a private pact between past and present. "Take your time," Daniel said, his voice a low, steady thing that did not demand. The words were ordinary. They carried, though,
the weight of every small victory they had ever had together. Ethan looked up, and for a second his eyes were raw with the effort of a child who had practiced brave things in silence. He moved his hand once more to the knob. He felt the cold give, turned, and the door opened. He stepped into the house. The house embraced him. The lights on the little tree winked as if at an old friend. The kettle on the stove hissed with a comforting rhythm that had been theirs for years. Daniel set down the groceries he had one hand on and reached instinctively to straighten a fallen ornament. He hummed the tune he had hummed for months, the same thread of sound stitched into their days, and Ethan paused in the doorway as if the hum had found something inside him it could call. For a moment there was only the hush, the kind that fills when voices go absent to keep watch. The hush was not emptiness, it was the place where something might be born. Daniel watched Ethan's face as if watching a page regain ink. The boy breathed in the warmth and the smell of spices, the texture of the handkerchief in the pocket of his father's coat, and then, as if a dam whose stones had been loosened, a small sound came out. "Dad," Ethan said, and the syllable, fragile as a twig first breaking, settled in the room like a dropped bell. Daniel's hand, which had been busy with the ornament, froze. For a stretch that felt like minutes and was only seconds, the world narrowed to the sound of his son's voice, the precise pitch he had missed for months, the slight crack that comes when something true is being formed. The single word expanded in the way a color blooms across a canvas. Ethan tried again, swallowing, surprised at the possibility of sound. "Daddy," he managed this time, a whisper that found a way into his father's heart. It was not a miracle announced by thunder or blare. Nothing about the moment professed a guarantee against future struggles. There would be therapy, careful work, learning to trust that speech could be safe.
But in that room, with the old handkerchief folded under Daniel's palm like a prayer, the voice's return felt like an answer of a more human kind. Relief, possession, a long-awaited touchstone arriving at their doorstep. Neighbors nearby heard, suddenly alert to a frequency they had tuned out. A woman returning from the fountain paused on the sidewalk. From the porch end of the block, a child's squeal of delight rose and fell. Inside, Daniel did not let the world rush the moment. He knelt to be eye level with Ethan and took his small hand. The fingers closed in a way that felt like a seal of reclaimed territory. He might have wept, perhaps he did, but the tears were not for spectacle. They were private geography of a man who had carried his family through nights and bills and the scraping ache of grief. Ethan's voice grew steadier with each small sentence. He said things that had never seemed urgent before, but now yawned open with meaning. "Home," he said, and then, stumbling over the simple grammar of returning to a language he'd guarded, he added, "We're home." The house responded in tiny ways. The kettle's whistle softened, the lights on the tree blinked like a chorus, and the handkerchief's thread held a story Daniel had only ever known how to tell in silence. Word spread, as it always does in small neighborhoods, through the corridor of porches, from one stoop to another, a rumor catching speed. People who had glanced and decided to look again found themselves at the edges of the street, embarrassed by the casualness of their prior distance. Victoria Lane, in her polished coat, stood on her porch and watched Ethan walk past her house and into the warm rectangle of their front room. She felt the shift not as an epiphany, but a small admission. She'd seen a man's constancy and made the mistake of turning it into an anecdote, when it was, in fact, a lifeline. She went inside then and fetched a small tin of biscuits, crossing the snow with the awkwardness of someone learning to do neighborly things properly. At the door, another neighbor, Mr. Collins, hovered with a to-go cup. He tipped a nod toward Daniel and Ethan with an acknowledgement that was neither dramatic nor obtrusive. It was enough. Small apologies could be made with modest gestures. Loud proclamations were unnecessary. Later, when the street quieted and the carols dimmed to memory, there came a knock at Daniel's door. He opened it to find Victoria standing with the tin and an earnest look he had not expected. "I saw," she said, not preface but plainly stated. "I should know. I admired what you were doing, and I thought perhaps these would be welcome." She extended the tin as if her gesture might bridge something larger than biscuits. Daniel accepted it with the kind of gratitude that tasted like spoken thanks and the unneed to explain. They sat together that night, father and son, an ordinary pair in a small room that now held new sound. Ethan fed the cat dry bits by hand and explained, in halting phrases, the thing he'd seen at the fountain and how the lantern had made shapes on the snow like little moons. Daniel listened and learned the weight of each newly spoken syllable. When the conversation quieted, he pulled the handkerchief from his pocket and laid it on the table between them like an offering.
Ethan reached out and touched the embroidered initials, a soft thumb finding the frayed letters. The handkerchief became, for a moment, all the proof needed that some threads persist even when the weave changes. In the days after, life did not rearrange into a fairy tale. Work remained, the bills continued to be present on the table like weather reports, and therapy appointments entered their calendar with the sober regularity of medical prescriptions. But the mood of the household shifted. Where once the silence had been a room that swallowed sound, there was now space for small conversations to begin again. Ethan practiced words like one tries climbing stairs after months away. Daniel sat with him at the edge of each step, steadying rather than pushing. The neighborhood, too, shifted in small increments. People who had been quick to look away found reasons to accept an invitation. A pie offered at the fence, a quiet apology from a neighbor who admitted to having been in a hurry to judge. The carol in the block seemed somehow to be sung a little more truly. At the local school, Miss Alvarez posted a note in the window celebrating the winter program. This time there was an additional little box at the bottom of the sign, open to all. Not a dramatic change, but a small policy shift that made the next year's list look different. She had seen the way a child's attempt to return to sound changed a community's tone. It was not the result of grand speeches, but of ordinary noticing. The teacher's choice to name the carol practice publicly as inclusive was not about recognition for herself. It was about loosening a habit of exclusion. There were private recognitions, too. One afternoon, a local reporter for the neighborhood paper stopped by, more curious than exploitative, wanting to know about the paper snowflake Ethan had made and the handkerchief Daniel kept like a relic. Daniel declined an interview at first. He preferred the quiet of the house to the glare of a camera. Yet when the reporter suggested a small note about neighborhood kindness under the headline "Quiet Heroes Among Us," Daniel agreed, on the condition that it would be about the people who quietly made their street better, a list of names and gestures that included Mr. Collins, Mrs. Park, Miss Alvarez, and the woman on the polished porch who had, in a small but sincere way, learned to step onto the street when it mattered. The piece ran with a photograph of Ethan and the tree, a candid shot that captured him mid-laugh as he slipped a paper star onto a branch. Comments trickled him.
Some were exactly one would expect, small encouragements and shared memories, but others were more surprising. A neighbor who had once crossed the street rather than greet Daniel left a note with a jar of preserves on his step. "For more evenings at your table," the note read, unsigned but earnest. Another envelope contained a small gift card for groceries and a paper stamped with the name of a clinic offering counseling sessions. The community's generosity did not erase the past month's harshness, but it began to form a network of support that felt, in time, like real infrastructure. For Daniel and Ethan, the holidays retained their gentle truth. They were a family rebuilding not by spectacle, but by the patient accumulation of small acts. On the night after Christmas, Daniel stood at the window and watched the street where traces of celebration still stuck to porches like confetti. Ethan came to stand beside him, his voice now an instrument practiced in honesty. "Can we put the star higher?" he asked, and Daniel smiled, lifting him up just enough to set the ornament at the top of the tree. The action was practical and ordinary and carried the kind of joy that does not need fanfare. The handkerchief folded neatly on the mantle, its threads frayed but intact. Daniel took it now and then and smoothed its edges, remembering the days when grief made language hard and the nights when silence seemed to gather like a storm. He kept the handkerchief not as a talisman that promised everything would be fixed, but as a reminder that some loves, if tended, can be the ground from which speech and laughter grow again. Months later, someone would recall the moment Ethan walked back into his home that Christmas as if it were a single shining event. In truth, it was both a culmination and an opening, a true voice returning not because of a sudden magic, but because it had been given a safe place to come back to. The community's eyes had softened, not overnight, but in a series of small admissions. Apologies made at doorsteps, a tin of biscuits offered without proclamation, a teacher who broadened a list to include every child. And the world, which sometimes believes that change requires grand gestures, watched instead as the modest things, a warm kettle, a folded handkerchief, a parent's steady hum, took effect. Daniel and Ethan kept living in the honest way of people who have rebuilt rooms, with glue for the cracks and footage to patch loose boards. There were still nights when doubt pressed close, and practical concerns rang like a second bell. But inside the house with the little tree, there was talk, there was laughter, there was the sound of a child saying the names of things he loved. If this story is speaking to you,
and you believe in the quiet power of ordinary kindness, consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. By the time the first thaw of the new year arrived, the street had new habits.
People greeted each other more often. They paused longer to hold a door or to check if the neighbor needed salt for the steps. Victoria Lane learned to cross her porch without checking the calendar of propriety, and the act of doing so taught her more about humility than any lecture ever could. Mr. Collins kept an extra pair of mittens behind the counter. Miss Alvarez saved a seat near the front whenever she suspected a child might need it. There are stories that demand a single image: a child speaking again, a door opening on Christmas, a handkerchief's thread. Yet the fuller truth lives in what followed: the therapy appointments that required patience, the conversations about fear, the nights when Daniel worried about work and called friends for small loans. These were not neat arcs toward a perfect ending. They were, instead, the long, sometimes messy work of being human, punctuated by a moment that made the work feel not in vain. Years later, a visitor might stand in Daniel's living room and point to the photograph on the mantle and ask where the handkerchief came from. Daniel would tell the story, not in grand details, but in a quiet language of memory: how small rituals had become lifelines, how a community's eye could sharpen into kindness if someone made it so. Ethan would, perhaps embarrassed but also proud, roll his eyes at the memory of the exact syllable he had managed to form the first time back in the doorway. The house, which weathered more than snow and bills, would hold those memories like weather-beaten stones in a garden path: useful, unshowy, steady. At the heart of the story is the modest notion that restoration does not always require dramatic rescues. Sometimes it requires a steady hand working the same few motions: a tune hummed into a kettle, the folding of a handkerchief, the patient offering of space for a child to come back to himself. The Christmas when Ethan walked back into his house and spoke again was, in that sense, not an isolated miracle, but the fruit of 1,000 small decisions: to show up, to refuse to let silence rule, to meet a child's hand at the threshold. On a clear night, with the tree lights a soft halo in the window, Daniel and Ethan stood at the doorway and watched the street. They felt the presence of neighbors passing by, the warmth of a community that had learned to be a little more attentive. The handkerchief lay folded, a quiet testament. Ethan kissed his father's cheek and said without prompting, "Thank you." The words were still sometimes heavy and sometimes bright, but they belonged. Daniel put an arm around him and answered in the voice that had waited to be heard for so long. "You're home, kiddo. You're home." If this story moved you, share it. Let kindness ripple.